Hello, welcome everyone. Today we are going to be exploring a fascinating aspect of qualitative research. This is called hermeneutics. My name is Ibrahim Osman Adam, and I will be guiding you through this practical approach to understanding and interpreting qualitative data using hermeneutics. Hermeneutics might sound like a very complex term, but at its core is something we all have been doing, something we have been doing naturally. And this involves interpreting and making meaning from information. In research, it is a systematic approach to understanding texts, conversations, and human experiences in depth. Before we look at the technical aspects, I want you to think about how you understand a novel or interpret a conversation with your friend. You don't just look at the words alone. You consider the context, the background, the subtle meanings, and how different parts connect to create the whole picture. In fact, that's essentially what hermeneutics is about. In this lecture series, we'll explore the principles of hermeneutic analysis, how to apply these principles to your qualitative research data, and then we'll also look at some practical techniques for interpreting qualitative data and maybe some common challenges. I hope that this guide would give you some hands-on approach to understanding the concepts in hermeneutics. So to emphasize again, after this presentation, I hope that you would be able to understand the 8 key concepts of hermeneutic analysis, and then how to apply these concepts in qualitative research. And then we'll also go through some practical strategies for implementing hermeneutical analysis. And then we'll look at some real-world applications and through a concrete research example. Now, let me share something interesting about hermeneutics with you. Hermeneutics actually has a quite remarkable journey as a research method. You might be surprised to learn that it originally started as a way to interpret biblical texts. So scholars would use these techniques to understand not just the words on a particular page, but their deeper meaning and context. There is something interesting about hermeneutics because over time, this method has evolved into something much more broader and more sophisticated. Today, in the social sciences, we use hermeneutics as a powerful tool for analyzing all kinds of qualitative data. So I want you to think of it as taking those same careful interpretation techniques and applying them to understanding the human experiences in our modern world. So in this tutorial, we're going to explore the 8 key concepts that make hermeneutical analysis so valuable. So we will not just be looking at abstract ideas, we will be looking at it practically so that it can help you understand or have a deeper meaning in terms of how you interpret your qualitative data using the concepts of hermeneutics. Now, to proceed, I want to set a stage for the practical nature of this particular session by looking at this specific research study. This is a perfect example to work with because it captures a unique moment in educational history that many of us can relate to. So we're going to consider a study that has to do with understanding teachers' lived experiences of emergency remote teaching. Now, if you look at this study, it tells us something very important. We are not just looking at what maybe teachers do, but we are also interested in how they experienced remote teaching and then also understood dramatic shift or change in their professional lives. Now, the research question that is guiding this is particularly well suited for hermeneutic analysis. And the research question is, how did teachers experience and make meaning of their sudden transition to online teaching? Now, notice how the research question focuses not just on what happened, but on meaning making. In fact, this is exactly where hermeneutics comes in. Now, in the next thing I want us to look at is in terms of the data collection. The data collection method is also very significant. And considering the nature of this study, in-depth interviews with 10 high school or senior high school teachers are used. Now, this gives us rich, detailed narratives to work with, because when we interview the teachers, we probably may have may tape record it, audio record it, and then we would have a handy transcript to deal with. Now, each interview is likely to contain various layers of meanings, the personal reflections of the teachers, and the contextual information that hermeneutical analysis can help us to unpack. The timing is also very important, because conducting the interviews in this particular case is going to take 6 months after the transition. This means teachers would have time to reflect on their experiences, develop their understanding, and make sense of the changes they went through. So in this case, they are not just going to be reporting their immediate reactions, but they will be sharing their process experiences and meanings. So before we look at the hermeneutical concepts, I want you to think about what this timing might mean for our analysis. How might teachers' understanding of their experiences, how has it evolved over those six months, and what context do we need to consider? Okay. Now, let's start by exploring the first key concept in hermeneutical analysis. The first key concept is historicity. Historicity is a very fascinating concept that provides out some grounding, some understanding of human experiences in time and context. Listen carefully. Historicity is a fascinating concept that will try to ground us or ground our understanding of human experiences in time and context. So you can think of historicity as the acknowledgement that we are all products of our time and place. It's like we are all watching a movie, but we are not just watching it. We are inside the movie, and our understanding is shaped by where we are in that broader story. So in more theoretical terms, historicity basically tells us that we cannot separate ourselves from our historical moments. Our historical moment, especially when we are trying to understand or interpret our experiences. Our experiences are all shaped by what we have done in the past. So historicity is not just about knowing when something happened. It is also about understanding how that particular moment in time is shaping how people's experience and their interests, or how they interpret events and their current interest. Now, let's apply this to our study of teachers during the emergency transition to online teaching. When we analyze their interviews, historicity will require us to consider several crucial layers. First, we need to understand the broader historical context of education, even before the disruption. So the question we may ask is, what was normal teaching like? How was it like? What were the standard practices and expectations then? We are more interested in what? In the history. Now, the second issue we have to consider is we need to pay attention to when these interviews were conducted. And going back to the case study, we indicated that 6 months after the transition. This timing is very important because teachers' perspectives might be different from their immediate reactions during the first week of online teaching. So if they have just introduced online teaching, their first week, their reaction will be different. But if 6 months has passed, their experiences in the past will shape their reaction to the online teaching. Now, the third thing we need to consider is we cannot ignore the historical development of online learning technologies. So some schools might have had better infrastructure or previous experience with online tools, while others may just be starting from what? From scratch. And then finally, we need to consider each teacher's prior experience with technology. So typically, a teacher who was already using digital tools to teach might have a very different story from someone who had never taught online before. So let's try to see a concrete example. If a teacher says that I never thought I'll be teaching this way, that statement means something different in 2020 than it would mean in what? In 2010. Or even it might mean different in our current 2025. The historical context, what I'm trying to explain is that the historical context gives this particular statement that the teacher would have said that he will not be able, he never thought he would be able to teach this way. The historical context will give that particular statement its full meaning. It will give it its full meaning. Now, let's analyze the interview quote again using the concept of historicity, because it is a great example that can show how historical context shapes meaning in qualitative research. Okay, so let's look at this quote. Using this interview excerpt, I have been teaching for 20 years, and I never thought I would have to become a YouTube creator overnight. Now, if you look at this particular quote, there's so much rich historical context packed into this single statement. So in terms of historicity analysis, we'll try to break it down. First, let's consider the teacher's 20-year career context. So this isn't just about a number. It actually represents 2 decades of developed teaching practices, experience, professional identity, and even the routines this particular teacher has been following. When this teacher says, I never taught, in fact, they are speaking from a place of extensive experience and established expectations about what teaching means. Then the next thing we need to do, we need to examine how previous teaching methods influence the teacher's perspective. Now, the contrast between the traditional classroom teaching and suddenly becoming a YouTube creator is particularly striking. So the use of the term, maybe a YouTube creator itself, is historically significant. Why is it historically significant? It is historically significant because being a YouTube creator, this particular phrase is relatively new, and it gives the teacher a new professional identity, and it didn't exist before, especially when the teacher started his career. So the historical moment of rapid technological adoption, in fact, is very crucial here. So the phrase in the quote, the phrase overnight, actually captures the unprecedented speed of this transition, how we have moved from the traditional to what? Being a YouTube creator sort of teaching. In normal times, educational changes typically happen gradually, maybe with even pilot programs and sometimes training period. But this particular scenario is different because it was an emergency situation. It was an emergency situation. Finally, what we need to reflect on is the revolution of teaching practices leading to this point. Now, we have to be very critical about certain things. For instance, questions like how has the technology been gradually entering classrooms before this particular moment? How was technology entering classroom before this moment? Then the other question we may ask is, what was the typical pace of technological adoption in education? All this will help us to understand why this sudden shift was so disruptive. Now, there's something also very interesting here, and this is about how this particular quote actually captures some kind of a collision between different historical timelines. That is, the teacher's personal professional history, the history of educational technology, and this specific moment of crisis-driven change. And the crisis-driven change is because of the emergency nature. Okay. Now, let's move on to look at our second principle, our second concept. Now, the second concept we want to look at is hermeneutical. In hermeneutical analysis, is a hermeneutic cycle. Now, to understand the hermeneutic cycle, you have to think of it like zooming in and out in terms of maybe when we want to take a picture. Now, when we are zooming in and out, you will realize that there's a change in what? In perspectives. And the change in perspective will help us to see something new. So when we zoom in and we zoom out, the way we see the images will what? Will differ. The hermeneutic cycle is really about understanding things we can't fully understand without looking at the parts. So the hermeneutic cycle basically says that in order to understand the whole, we must understand the parts. And in order to understand the parts, we must understand the whole. This may sound a bit paradoxical, but in actual fact, that is how we naturally make sense of what? Complex situations. So let's use a practical example. So first, when we are dealing with the hermeneutic cycle, employing the hermeneutic cycle, what we need to do first is we need to read individual statements, individual texts as part of our data. We need to read the individual statement. These are the parts. Maybe, say, for instance, maybe a teacher says, I started recording my lectures. That's just one piece. Then we can try to see how we can connect this to the entire interview, which is the what? The whole. Perhaps maybe throughout the interview we may conduct, this same teacher may talk about gaining confidence with technology and maybe feeling more organized and getting positive student feedback. Now, when we return to that original statement that the teacher made about recording lectures, we'll see it differently. We'll see it differently. It is not just about we'll see that it's not just about the teaching technique. It may represent a key moment in the teacher's professional growth or adaptation. And so as we repeat this cycle, we go back and forth, our understanding will be what? Will be deepening. Each time we move between the parts and the whole, we may notice new connections and new meanings. Maybe we realize that recording lectures wasn't just about teaching. It was about regaining control in maybe a particular situation for this particular lecturer or teacher. Now let's see how it plays out with a practical example. And we'll analyze this quote, which says that the first few weeks were chaos. But looking back, it was a turning point in how I think about teaching. Now, let's analyze this quote through the hermeneutic cycle. And we have to look at it in terms of what I explained earlier, from the part to the whole, and from the whole to the part. If you are looking at it in the first part to whole, you see the word chaos. Chaos initially appears as negative in that particular quote, but connecting it to the whole interview reveals that it is a catalyst for what? For change. The chaos was a catalyst for change. It was not negative in that sense. Then, when we're also looking at it from the whole to the parts, we need to understand the broader transformation and how it helps reframe the chaos as a necessary kind of a disruption. So we'll keep going back and forth. So another part to a whole scenario is the turning point. The point, the quote says, it was a turning point in how I think about teaching. The turning point, this particular language actually signals that this isn't about what? Chaos. So you see the word chaos was used previously, but if you look at how this particular phrase pops up, it was a turning point. That particular phrase and this particular language actually signals that this isn't just about chaos, but about what? A change in the way teaching, or change in the way teaching is what is being transformed. So the hermeneutic cycle involves a secular analysis, and this secular analysis reveals how the initial disruption led to maybe a deeper professional growth, and maybe through that we'll see a pattern that might be missed. We might see patterns that might be missed. if we didn't do the multiple analytical back and forth. Now, another way to look at it is we can apply the hermeneutic cycle to this rich interview quote in a different way. The first few weeks, for instance, they indicated in the quote, the first few weeks were chaos. But looking back, it was a turning point. Now, this is a perfect example to demonstrate how we move between parts and the whole. So first, we can examine the chaos description as a part. You see, the word choice here is very important, chaos, because chaos suggests some kind of what, a disorder, and then perhaps maybe a feeling of what, helplessness. But when we focus just on this particular part, we see that there's some kind of an emotional impact of the transition because people seem to be what? Helpless. Now, if we try to connect this to the full interview context, that is the whole, perhaps elsewhere in the interview, the teacher may describe specific challenges they face, the solutions they develop, or even some support systems they discovered. Then later on, we can return to understand how this chaos led to what? Led to the transformation. And then finally, we can relate this transformation to the broader narrative. Okay. Now, the third concept is prejudice. Prejudice. Now, given this particular word, I know what you may be thinking, but prejudice as a concept in hermeneutic is not actually quite different from how we typically use the word. In hermeneutics, prejudice has a special meaning. It has a special meaning, and a special meaning which is very good for the analysis of qualitative research. So in hermeneutics, prejudice is not a negative thing. It's not a negative thing at all. Instead, it tries to refer to some kind of a pre-understanding we are bringing to the research data analysis. It's like having some kind of a mental library of experiences. We have a lot of experience in our head and the knowledge that we'll use it to make sense of what? Of new information. So it basically is not dealing with negativity, but refers to what? Our pre-understanding and how that is going to shape how we interpret what? We interpret new information. Now, how can it be practically applied? How can it be practically applied? As researchers, we need to first identify our own assumptions in relation to the code we are using. We need to first identify our assumptions about teaching and technology. Maybe we assume that younger teachers will be able to adapt more easily to technology, or that certain subjects are harder to teach online. These are not necessarily wrong, but we need to recognize that we all would have some kind of what? Assumptions. Then we need to acknowledge how maybe our educational background influences our interpretation. If you have been a teacher yourself, you might interpret the data differently than someone who has never taught, you see. So in that case, either the new teacher or the old teacher, their perspectives will not be wrong, but we need to be aware of how our background is what? Is shaping how we are going to be interpreting things and how we are going to be understanding things. So this is why it's so important to document our preconceptions even before we start our analysis. We have to document it. For example, before we analyze our teacher interviews, we might have to just make some notes. We may have to write down our expectations about what we think we will find, what do we already know about emergency remote teaching or online teaching. We need to be open to challenging these prejudices. We need to be open to challenging these prejudices. Now, let's examine this example of prejudice, how it can be documented in hermeneutics research. This is what honest, reflective research would look like in practice. So let's look at this researcher's statement. It says, as a former teacher who used technology extensively, I might assume that technological adaptation is easier than it actually is for others. I need to bracket this assumption when analyzing teacher struggles. You see, this is a perfect example of prejudice, how prejudice can be documented. And it is a perfect example for a number of reasons. One, you should pay particular attention and you would see that you will see how the researcher in this particular prejudice documentation clearly identifies their background. The researcher starts by saying that as a former teacher, the researcher is clearly identifying their background, a former teacher who used technology extensively. The teacher is recognizing that their personal experience is shaping their perspective. And so it's not just about the background information. The researcher is acknowledging how their experience might influence what? Their interpretation. Then secondly, they specifically name their assumption. That is the second set of words. I might assume that technological adaptation might seem easier to them than it actually is for others. That is an assumption. And the researcher is specifically naming it. And this is so important because if the assumptions are named, the unnamed assumptions are the ones most likely to influence our analysis. So it is better the researcher names the assumption. Then the third one is, which is also very important, the researcher acknowledges the need to bracket this assumption. In hermeneutics, bracketing doesn't mean ignoring our pre-understanding. Basically, what it means is that consciously we're setting them aside so that we can remain open to different expectations and different interpretations and our different experiences. So in all of this kind of self-awareness is very important when we are analyzing statements. So for instance, the statement that I struggle with the basic setup of online meetings. A researcher without this documented prejudice, this particular set of code we have there, that's the prejudice documentation. So if we have a researcher who hasn't got this documented prejudice, he might just dismiss the struggles as simple or even trivial or something that's missing. Okay, now let's move to the next concept, autonomization. Let's explore this particular concept. It's one of the most intriguing concepts when we're dealing with hermeneutical analysis. And I want you to think of it like looking at a piece of maybe a picture. And once the picture is created, the picture can take on meanings, several kinds of meanings that even the one who took the picture may not even intend. Theoretically, autonomization basically means that once something is said, or once we say something, or we write something, it will take on a life of its own. So the moment the researcher, something is written down, something is spoken, the assumption is that it will take on a life of its own. The meaning becomes independent from what the original speaker or the original writer intended. And this is fascinating, especially in interviews, because it allows we, the researchers, to discover different layers of meaning that might not be obvious to the participant. So let's see how this works practically when analyzing interviews. The first thing I want us to consider is we have to always let the text stand independently. So whatever is written, we have to let it stand independently. For example, when a teacher says, I had to reinvent everything overnight. Look at that quote. I had to reinvent everything overnight. We have to look at this statement on its own terms, on its own merit. We don't have to look at it in terms of actually what the teacher is conveying. So we can look at it in terms of what the teacher is conveying, but the text must also be seen in its own right, and we try to digest this to find out what does it really mean. That way, we can look for meanings beyond what the intended writer has put up. Maybe this statement is not about maybe changing teaching method. It might reveal something deeper than what the person who wrote it or the person who said it means. Okay? It's also very important because it allows multiple interpretations to emerge. And more importantly, we need to document any insights, unexpected insights. We need to document it, because sometimes the most valuable things, the most valuable findings meanings we didn't actually anticipate. So if something unexpected insights pops up, we need to try to document it. Now, let's analyze a quote using autonomization. So, and the quote says, I had to learn to let go of control. Now, if you look at this particular quote, at first glance, it might seem a bit straightforward. But when we let this statement speak for itself, it will reveal multiple layers of meanings. So let's start with the direct meaning. The teacher is, if you look at the direct meaning, if a teacher says, I had to let go, I had to learn to let go of control. Here, the teacher is talking about classroom management challenges. But in the immediate context, they may probably be referring to the practical difficulties of managing the online or an online classroom where they couldn't physically monitor what students are doing or they couldn't even control the learning environment. But let's see how autonomization helps us to uncover broader meanings. First, we see professional identity transformation. Because when a teacher says they had to let go of control, it suggests something. It suggests that there's a fundamental shift in how the teacher view their role as an educator. The word had to means this wasn't a chosen, it wasn't a chosen transformation, but maybe the teacher was forced to let go. And this tells us something. This tells us something about how maybe crisis can reshape professional identity. Because you will see that the teacher didn't do it willingly. I had to let go. It means the teacher was forced. Then we can also see another part. Then we can see shifting patterns, shifting pedagogical paradigms. So letting go of control, that's the word. Letting go of control. This might represent some kind of a movement from maybe a teacher-centered approach to student-centered learning. In this case, the online learning environment may have forced a reconceptualization of what teaching means. You see, from controlling to what? Facilitating learning. Because when you are teaching, when the students are sitting right in front of you, how you are able to exert control is different from how you are able to exert control, how you are able to facilitate control. It will change. And then finally, there's a story of personal growth here through this crisis. The phrase in there, learn to let go. The teacher had to learn to let go. If you look at this carefully, though it suggests some kind of emotions there and psychological maybe adaptation, but it goes beyond just professional development. It is about the teacher's even his personal resilience to stay back and let go of things. Now, if you look at all the different interpretations we are trying to provide, all these interpretations exist independently of what maybe the teacher meant when they made this particular statement. And that's what autonomization is all about. Now, the fifth concept, let's explore the fifth concept. The fifth concept is distanciation. Now, if you look at distanciation carefully, it's about creating a distance when we are trying to understand something deeply. So let's think about it this way. You take a step back, and then you need you take a step back to see the bigger picture clearly. Because if you are too close, you'll not be able to see the picture. In theoretical terms, what it involves is we use this to create what? And what we refer to as analytical distance from our data, while we still try to acknowledge that we are part of the interpretation process. So basically, the best way to explain it is to say that it is like being both an observer and a participant in your research. That's what distanciation is all about. Now, practically, how can it be applied? How can it be applied? You can apply it first by taking time between data collection and data analysis. It's very crucial. When you conduct an interview, for instance, you see that you may be emotionally and intellectually involved in the conversation you've had with the participant. But by waiting before you analyze it, you can approach the text with fresh eyes. You wait for some time. You can approach it with fresh eyes. So for instance, if we look at our teacher study, that 6 months gap between the transition and the interviews can actually do what? It can actually help. Now, you can also use a structured analytical framework as a key strategy. And these frameworks can help us move beyond our immediate reactions to see patterns we may have what? We may have missed. Then we may also have to try to engage with other researchers, which is also very valuable. And finally, maintaining detailed analytical memos can also help us to create that necessary distance. Okay. Now, let's see how distanciation works using a practical example. We analyze this. Let's use this analytical memo to demonstrate distanciation in action. This particular memo is a great example of how creating analytical distance can lead to deeper insight. So let's go through it. 2 weeks after the interview, I noticed themes. It's after the interview, the researchers stepped back and noticed themes about professional identity that weren't apparent during the conversation. The temporal distance allows me to see patterns in the teacher's narrative about loss and reconstruction of teaching identity. You see, when we look at this memo carefully, the memo shows us several key aspects of what? Successful distanciation. Let's look at one after the first. Look at the timing. 2 weeks after the interview. 2 weeks after the interview. This temporal distance is very important. So during the interview, the researcher was likely focused on managing the conversation, asking good follow-up questions, probing questions, and responding to immediate content. But with some distance, the researcher could see deeper patterns emerging. Now, the second issue is observing how the researcher acknowledges the difference between their initial understanding and then what? The later insights. The themes about the professional identity were not immediately apparent. You realize that they emerge through distancing process. And this shows how stepping back can reveal different layers of meaning we may have missed. And then finally, also try to see how you will also notice how the researcher identifies specific patterns, loss, and what? And reconstruction of teaching identity. The distance hasn't made the analysis more vague. Instead, what it has done is that it has allowed for more precise and maybe better understanding. And this is very powerful in our study example. Distanciation, take a step back, and then the timing is very important so that you'll be able to observe the difference between your initial understanding and what? The later insights. Now, the fifth concept we want to explore is appropriation. Appropriation. Now, with appropriation, I want you to think of it as maybe building a bridge between the texts and our understanding. And when we're doing this, we also still have to be careful not to change the original landscape. In more simple terms, appropriation is about making meaning our own without losing the essence of what we are studying. It involves making the meaning of the text our own. And then we integrate it into our understanding while respecting other views. So let's see how we can break it down in a practical way. First, we need to connect our findings to our research framework. So for example, if we are studying maybe teacher resilience during online transition, we might appropriate teachers' experiences into what? Existing frameworks of professional adaptation. Then we try to relate our interpretations to existing theory. Maybe a teacher's experience of letting go of control connects with theories of transformative learning. But what we have to do is we may have to maintain the specificity of their emergency remote teaching context. It is also very important to maintain the integrity of what? Original meanings. So while we are making connections to theory or our own understanding, we cannot distort what the participants actually said and meant. And this part is the respecting its otherness. We have to respect the part of what? The participants. And then finally, we need to document how our understanding is evolving. Carefully, we need to write it down because as we work with the data, our interpretation may change. And tracking this evolution is very important part of what the appropriation process. Okay. Now let's see an example. Let's analyze this research note as it demonstrates appropriation and action. So let's look at this note. The teacher's experience of becoming a different kind of teacher resonates with transformation theory while adding new dimensions about crisis-driven change. This appropriation, this is appropriation, but it works at what? At different levels. And we'll try and see the different levels. First, you may notice how the researcher connects the teacher's personal experience. That is, becoming a different kind of teacher with existing transformation theory. Basically, what they are doing is that they are making the meaning their own by placing it within a theoretical framework they perfectly understand. But what's really very skillful here is how they are able to maintain the integrity of the original experience. So look at the phrase, while adding new dimensions about crisis-driven change. And this shows they recognize that this experience contributes something unique to our understanding. So they are not just fitting the data into existing theory. That's not what they are doing. They are allowing it to expand our theoretical understanding. Now, the last but not the least concept is engagement. And engagement is really about having an active conversation with our research data. So it's not just about passively reading, going through our data. It's about developing a relationship with what? With the text, our textual data. Engagement basically emphasizes that understanding will come through what? Through a dialogue with our what? The textual data. So you have to think of all this process like having a conversation with your data, where both you and the text are contributing to what? To creating some kind of a meaning. Practically, how can this happen? Let me break these practical engagement strategies down carefully. First, active reading and rereading is very important. Each time you read through an interview transcript, you would see that you will be doing so with fresh eyes, and you may be asking what? New questions. Maybe on your first read of the teacher's account, the example we give, you notice the practical challenges. But on your second reading, you may pick up some other emotional undertones. Now, the second issue is questioning the text. It's very important. Questioning the text is very critical. So when a teacher says something like, it was impossible at first, we as a researcher might ask, what made it impossible? Or what made it seem impossible? Then we may also ask, what changed to make it possible later? All these questions are critical. We may also try to write what? Our reflective responses. Our reflective responses will help us deepen our engagement with the text, because after reading an interview transcript, you might write about maybe your initial reactions, the questions that arose, corrections you noticed, or things that actually surprised you. And then finally, you may engage in a dialogue with other researchers, because this may enrich your understanding. So sharing your interpretations with colleagues to try to understand what their perspectives are. All right, very important. All right, now let's look at an example of engagement. Let's look at this researcher's note. The researcher notes that after my third reading of this interview, I began asking, what does survival mode mean in this context? How does it relate to professional identity? These questions led to new insights about adaptive teaching strategies. Now, if you look at this particular note, it's a perfect example of engagement in action at different levels. First, let's see. I'm not sure if you notice the iterative nature. Third reading. It means the researcher read it multiple times. Third reading. This shows how repeated engagement with the text can reveal new layers of what? Meaning. because each reading is the researcher doesn't consider each reading as a repetition. Each reading is a new conversation with what? With the data. And we as researchers, that's how, when we rely on the concept of engagement, that's how we have to see how we engage with data. You read it, and read it again, and you don't see it as repetition. Then also try to see how the researcher questions the text. They are not just accepting survival mode. If you look at the code carefully, they are not accepting it. They are asking probing questions. And this more or less looks like peeling back different layers of an onion to reveal, they are trying to reveal what? Deeper and deeper meanings. Last concept we want to look at is the concept of fusion of horizons. The concept of fusion of the horizons. This might sound a bit abstract, but let's see how we can explain it very well. Now, the fusion of horizons is a concept that comes from typical hermeneutics, and which involves the study of interpretation. The fusion of horizon actually occurs when our understanding merges with the text, the meaning of the text. And when this happens, it creates new knowledge, but will still reflect or respect our understanding and the meaning of the text. So practically, to understand the fusion of the horizons very well, let's see how it can be applied in real world scenario. The first you have to consider when practically applying it is to identify your interpretive horizon. What do you mean by interpretive horizon? First of all, as a researcher, you have to start engaging your text by acknowledging your own perspective, your biases, your experiences, your knowledge, and then all of this that you are bringing to the table. This self-awareness is very, very important, and that is what we refer to as what? Interpretive horizon. Now, the second is to recognize the text historical horizon. You have to consider the text, the context of the text. So a typical question you may ask is, when was the text written? What was happening at that time? Understanding the historical backdrop, it will help you to appreciate the text's original meaning as at the time it was written. And then the third is for you to document where these perspectives are meeting. Because as you analyze, you will note points where your understanding and the text meaning when it was first written, where they intersect. And these are the moments these are the moments of fusion. And then the last but not the least is for you to be able to articulate the new understanding that is emerging from the fusion of the interpretive horizon and the historical horizon. Now, an example. Let's analyze this example of a fusion analysis. The intersection of my understanding of pedagogical theory with the teacher's lived experiences reveals new insights about crisis-driven innovation in education. This fusion helps articulate how traditional teaching practices can be transformed through necessity while maintaining educational value. Now, if you look at this particular analysis, this particular note is a perfect demonstration of fusion horizons which are working at different levels. Now, the first thing you notice is that there's a clear identification of two horizons. The researcher's theoretical understanding of what? Pedagogy. And it's clearly indicated, my understanding of pedagogical theory. And then the second one is the teacher's lived experiences, which is the second one. So when you look at the interpretive horizon and the historical horizon, so the intersection of my understanding, interpretive horizon, teachers' lived experiences, and that's the historical horizon. You see that the phrase will reveal new insights, and it will show how this particular fusion will create new knowledge. And when this new knowledge that's created, neither perspective alone would have been able to generate it. Okay. Finally, you also have to look at how the fusion resolves what might seem like a contradiction. So how can traditional teaching practices be transformed while maintaining educational values. So you see that there's a merged understanding, and this merged understanding shows how crisis can do what? It can drive innovation without sacrificing maybe some core educational principles. So this kind of fusion is especially valuable in this particular study because it helps us to understand the educational transformation in a way that is both theoretical and what relying on the teacher's real experiences. Now let's wrap up our exploration of hermeneutical analysis and what it means for our research practice. What we have covered in this particular session is much more than just a set of analytical tools. We have explored 8 key concepts that work together. Historicity to help us understand context, hermeneutic circle to show us how past and whole inform each other. Prejudice reminds us to acknowledge our pre-understandings. Autonomization allows text to speak independently. Distanciation helps us maintain analytical perspectives. Appropriation helps us make meaning while respecting original intent. Engagement keeps us actively involved with our data. And the last but not the least, the fusion of horizons. The fusion of horizons brings together different perspectives to create new understanding. So as researchers, if we systematically apply these concepts, we'll be able to develop interpretations that are both deep and defensible. Okay. Now, let's wrap up our exploration of hermeneutical analysis and then what it means for our research practice. Okay. Thank you very much.